Welcome to Dark Water Rising. In this file, we're going to be reading Chapter 8. So please have your book out and open to page 62. Chapter 8. The north wind had swept clouds into thin wisps across the sky like fine white silk, and other than being hotter than usual, the day was turning out well. Like before, Mr. Farrell put me to work with Josiah and Zach, and again the three of us fell into that indefinable rhythm. Hammers rang, saws rasped, and the hours slipped away. By evening I heard a girl's voice looked over the balcony railing. My heart gave a wild thump and jumped into my throat. The girl was Ella Rose. She stood below, talking to Henry and Mr. Farrell, but her face looked clouded and serious. Zach and Josiah walked down with me to see what was going on, and Frank and Charlie followed. "The storm flag went up this morning," Ella Rose said when she saw me. "I wasn't sure if any of you had heard." Her hair billowed in the strengthening breeze, and bright tendrils caught on her lashes and in the corner of her mouth. "Are you planning to work tomorrow, boss?" Henry asked. Mr. Farrell nodded. "If it rains, we'll work inside." I glanced at the clouds tumbling in from the northeast. It was a good thing Frank and Charlie had finished the shingling today. Mr. Farrell squinted toward the sun and checked his watch. "Guess we'll call it a day, boys, and hope for the best tomorrow." "Are you walking?" I asked Ella Rose. She nodded. "And you?" "Every day," I said. "If you don't mind waiting while I put away the tools, I would be happy to keep you company. Josiah goes that way, too." A startled look swept across Josiah's face. He helped put everything away, then took off north with Zach and his brothers. "Where are you going?" I called after him, but he either didn't hear or didn't want to hear. I turned to Ella Rose and shrugged. "Want to follow the beach for a few blocks?" She nodded, and I took her books. We walked past the Midway and the giant bathhouses where only a few souls braved the waves this evening, riding huge swells that seemed to almost touch the lamps suspended over the surf. There surely wouldn't be any nude bathing beyond the lights tonight. Then it hit me. With the storm coming, there probably wouldn't be any bathing tomorrow either, of any kind. I glanced at Ella Rose, wondering if she'd already thought of that. Of course, we hadn't made a real date, but even so, it would be a dark disappointment if a whole week passed before I had a chance to see her again. "The waves look strange, don't they?" she asked. A strong wind pushed against my back as I looked out over the rough surf. I tried to see what was different, but I hadn't been here long enough to know what was strange and what wasn't. "Usually a north wind pushes the tide out, leaving hardly a ripple on the water. Mr. Farrell, this is Mr. Farrell told me this evening that the whole Gulf should be looking so shallow you'd think you could walk all the way to Cuba if you wanted." She shook her head. "That's not happening this time." I squinted out over the waves, wondering why this north wind was different. "But storms happen here all the time, so they can't be all that bad, can they?" She shrugged. "About 15 years ago a little town not far from here called Indianola was completely washed away, scattered all across the prairie. But everyone says it couldn't happen again, and certainly not here in Galveston. We get storms and overflows all the time, and they never last long or do much damage. It's kind of exciting, really, watching the waves and seeing the water rise up in the streets and yards." I looked at the way her eyes shone and realized that there was nothing I'd like better than to experience my first island storm with Ella Rose. We turned back toward Avenue N, past Ursuline and the Garten Verein, and then headed up 35th Street. I saw Andy and Will playing on the veranda at Uncle Nate's. I waved, then glanced down the side of the house to the alley, curious to see if Josiah had made it home. He'd stirred something uneasy in me, leaving quick the way he had. I caught a glimpse of him helping Ezra in the garden as we passed by. He'd walk straight home after all, just not with us. I said good-bye to Ella Rose at the foot of her stairs, but she insisted I come up to meet her father. My stomach rolled like one of those giant swells rushing toward the beach. I glanced at my dirty fingernails and scuffed shoes and shook my head. Another time, maybe, when I haven't been working. She laughed. You don't know Daddy. He'd much rather see you grimy from working hard than all spiffy and clean. I pulled in a deep breath, smoothed my wind-blown hair, and followed her up the stairs. She took her books from me, set them on a side table in the foyer, and dragged me to the parlor. I tossed a quick glance at the piano in the corner, the artwork on the walls, and the family portrait of Ella Rose and her parents sitting on a mantel in a gilded frame. Daddy? Mr. Covington looked up from his newspaper. I'd like you to meet Seth Braden. He's new to Galveston and already has a fine job working for Mr. Farrell. You remember Mr. Farrell, don't you, Daddy? Henry works for him, too. Mr. Covington nodded. So, you're a builder, are you, Seth? Yes, sir, I said, rubbing my sweaty palm against my pants. At least I'd like to be. I held out my hand, hoping, like everything, that it was clean enough to shake. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. His warm grasp eased my mind somewhat. Ella Rose gave her father a shiny smile. I stopped by to see if Henry and the others knew about the storm warning, and Seth was kind enough to see me home. Ah, yes, Isaac Klein raised a flag above the levee building this morning. He shook his head. But you know how those weathermen are. Always making a big to-do over every little blow. I nodded, the last of my concern about the storm finally gone. Even Mr. Covington wasn't worried. For the next few minutes he asked the kind of questions I suppose all newcomers are asked, and I answered the best I could, acutely aware that his impression of me would determine whether I saw his daughter again or not. When we finally said our goodbyes, I blew out a relieved breath and headed home. With a storm coming, I might not see Ella Rose again till next weekend, but if her father didn't like me, I might not ever see her again. When I got home, it appeared that the Vedder children had become the envy of the neighborhood. Their daddy's ragged hearse bumped along behind old gray Whiskers, and a solemn procession of mourners followed, heads bent, hands full of jasmine and oleander blossoms. I laughed. Hey, who died? Up popped Kate, grinning from behind the hearse's ragged velvet drapery and waving a bunch of jasmine vines at me. Look at me, Seth! I waved back and headed for the stairs. Matt sat sulking on the bottom step beside Lucas, his baseball in his lap. They're playing funeral, Lucas grumbled. Matt huffed at his irritation. Ain't that just about the dumbest thing you ever saw? I looked again. They'd pulled Kate from the hearse and laid her in the grass. She lay deathly still while they covered her with flowers. Something cold and sick squirmed inside me, and I found myself wanting to chase the brats home, grab Kate up, bring her into the house with me. But I turned my back on the scene instead and squeezed around Matt and Lucas. Yeah, pretty dumb, all right, I muttered, and headed upstairs to find my cold supper. That night I pulled Ella Rose's handkerchief from my pocket. The scent of lilac water still clung to it, making me wonder if her skin smelled as sweet. I folded it, set it on my night table, and turned my thoughts to the storm. Mr. Covington hadn't been worried at all, but in the dark the house seemed to creak and sigh more than usual, and when I was very still I could feel the deep thudding of Gulf swells falling upon the beach just blocks away. The shock waves vibrated up the walls, through the floor, and right into my bones. This concludes Chapter 8 of Darkwater Rising. Thank you for listening.